Yell and we'll raise your hand. We'll send them back.
So,
I'm sorry, Jim. Go ahead.
okay. So I was previously the program coordinator for the American Friends Service Committee in Western Massachusetts. Due to some financial troubles at the national level, a number of AFSC offices were closed last year across the country, and ours, unfortunately, was one of them. But because we have quite a progressive community and quite a long history, starting with Francis Crowe back in 1968, we were able to, like a phoenix, rise from the ashes, and AFSC in Western Massachusetts is now the Resistance Center for Peace and Justice. And we're not only sort of like the continuation of the organization, sort of unofficially, but also officially, the American Friends Service Committee recognizes us as the successor program in Western Massachusetts. What we do is what we have done. I mean, part of it is what we've been doing for a very long time, since the 1960s and Francis's work around peace and militarism. We primarily identify as a peace center, which is a rare thing these days. And the lens by which we see the different work that needs to be done is through the lens of the United States being a militaristic culture and needing to address the ills that militarism brings. We have a number of programs that are some the continuation of what we have been doing, but also we're sort of expanding and branching out a little bit. And for those of you who are on our email list, you will get our weekly email or bi-weekly email tomorrow announcing that we're actually expanding a little bit. We're hiring a 10-hour-a-week office manager, and then in about a month we're going to be also looking for a program coordinator part-time who's going to be doing some work around our military recruitment report. So we're sort of, for the first time, growing a bit. So it's been a very rocky time, but we're at the moment doing okay, doing pretty well. We're beginning to prosper in ways that wasn't really imaginable before under at AFSC. So the work that we've done before and that we continue to do, I'll go over briefly, and most of it's in the pamphlet, and then I'll talk about a little bit about the new work. And then I think the questions are probably the most useful part of this. So I'll save most of my time for answering any questions that people have. And in case you are interested in signing up on our listserv or getting our newsletter, that's our clipboard right there. So the stuff that we are continuing to do, that we have done for a long time, is just supporting organizations and nonprofits and sort of community groups as much as possible, as we have in the past. So for instance, if anybody knows of Springfield No One Leaves, that's an anti-eviction, anti-foreclosure group in Springfield that we helped launch and get off the ground back in 2010, 2011. We are continuing to do work with them, organizing trainings for eviction blockades, civil disobedience. That's part of the work that we do. I've been in touch actually with some students from Northampton High School about organizing a nonviolent direct action training for the very newly engaged activists there. There were two events in the last few weeks. There was the walkout of the school, which I was happy to support by providing the sound system and some logistical support for the students when they did that. And then also, if anybody was in the crowds around City Hall on the March for Our Lives in Northampton, you might have seen me in my red hat on City Hall, fiddling with the microphones and the sound levels and everything as all of the different speakers, and then 3 different bands played. So that's part of what we have done in the past and will continue to do, is basically when people say that they need support, when organizations say that they need support, we provide it. There's a number of groups that meet regularly in our office to plot for troublemaking and so forth in the community. That's what we're happy to help foster and develop. So that's part of the work that we do. Another piece of work that we do is what I had referred to before, which is the military recruitment report. And we're coming out next week with our third edition of that report. And what this report is a survey of 52 public schools in Western Massachusetts, all of the public schools in Western Massachusetts and the 4 counties of Western Massachusetts, and how much access they allow to military recruiters, how much they allow different militaristic programs or tests like the ASVAB to be taken in their school.
The what?
ASVAB. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's essentially a test that military recruiters use to sort of identify and get the information of high school students. And so in the past, we've previously visited schools and talked to students and tried to talk to them about alternatives to military service. But what we've sort of shifted to is a more comprehensive look at where the military is in terms of the high schools, how often military recruiters go in. In some Springfield schools, we have found that they're in 2 times a week, sometimes 3 times a week. And this has unfortunately become a lot more relevant because one of the things that we've been tracking for several years now is the prevalence of JROTC programs in high schools. And the reason why I say unfortunately is because it turns out that the school shooter in Florida was actually learned how to shoot in a JROTC program at his high school. And so this is a piece of the work that we have done in the past and we continue to do, and we're hoping that it's going to make a much bigger impact now that when we release it. The next version we intend upon releasing in collaboration with the ACLU actually in Massachusetts. So that's one piece of work that we do, is particularly looking at the militarization of young people. And most parents and grandparents that I talk to don't realize that military recruiters are actually in the high schools of their kids or grandkids on a regular basis and soliciting them. And so that's just one thing that we're trying to raise up and point out as something that needs to be addressed. Another piece of work that we do is around immigration and immigration reform and policy. This is something that I started to do in 2010 through AFSC. And before it had the moniker of sanctuary cities and sanctuary legislation, we were passing resolutions and urging for executive orders in Springfield, Amherst, Northampton, and in the last couple of years we've pushed for these things in Greenfield, in Belchertown, in East Hampton. We have an upcoming vote in Conway. When we recognized that the deportation of undocumented folks was a rising crisis back in 2010, 2011, we began to do this work in Western Massachusetts, and we continue to do it today. Unfortunately, the big piece that we were pushing people to do in the last year was the Safe Communities Act, which is a piece of state legislation that would cover the entirety of the state and all cities and towns. Unfortunately, that's been whittled away such that it's not going to feasibly be passed. And even if it did pass, the state of the bill is actually not in a good place at the moment. So we're going to be continuing to do the work of city by city, town by town, trying to stand up for folks who are undocumented and sort of decrease the amount of terror that they feel. And if anybody doubts that is real, then I encourage you to watch last week tonight with John Oliver. He did a segment last night at 11 o'clock on his show that highlights the real absurdity of immigration courts. Most people don't understand the distinction between civil immigration law and criminal law. Immigration law is a civil section of the law. It is not the same thing as if you go to court and you're, assigned a lawyer and so forth. In immigration court, you are not granted a lawyer. And in fact, it's so ridiculous that in immigration courts, you can be a 3 or 4 year old child and be expected to, as a child, be able to represent yourself. I'm not kidding. I mean, we've known this for quite some time, and how crazy the immigration system and particularly the immigration enforcement system is. But it's sort of now being popularized, and our job is a lot easier in convincing people about how draconian the immigration system is. Just two more pieces of work that we do that I'm going to mention, and one is that since the late 70s, AFSC has been working with younger people, interns, volunteers in the office or in Francis's basement, and when I started in 2009, one of the things that I did was increase the number of interns such that we get on average between 8 to 12 a year that come through our office. We have established partnerships with 4 of the 5 colleges in departments within those colleges that we host and train basically young people, college students, sometimes high school students, sometimes graduate students, and we pay them. We not only train them to do social justice work, but we also pay them in order to...
I've got to ask, which is the college that you don't...
Mount Holyoke. It's just because it's so far away.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's just too much of a bus ride. We have had agreements with colleges, if not to pay students to intern and to learn how to do organizing and learn about the basics of social justice history. We also have students that are there getting class credit. And the thing that I say all the time is that if we believe that the next generation of people should be stepping up to the plate, that they should be responsible, that they should be activists, then we should probably consider that it's worth their time to actually pay them to do this work. And so all of our interns either get paid or they get credit, or sometimes both. And that's a program that we are continuing and have reestablished. And finally, the last thing that I'll mention, in probably our biggest campaign, and one that we're doing with some locals here in town, Tim Wallace and Vicki Elson, is the Nuclear Ban campaign. And that is a campaign to bring the nuclear weapons ban treaty that was adopted by the UN this summer to the United States. Tim Wallace is from the UK. He actually was born in Northampton, went to the UK, and has served as the executive director of the Nonviolent Peace Force, as well as the United Kingdom Quakers on disarmament issues. He's come back to take care of his mother, but also to help launch in the United States an effort to get the U.S., as 124 countries have done, to adopt the new prohibition on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so I had the honor and pleasure and bizarre experience of going to the Nobel Peace Prize conference in Oslo this past December, because the winner of that was the ICAN, which is the International Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And our campaign, our nuclear ban campaign here in the United States, has been recognized now as an official partner of ICAN, and we're working starting here, but also in California, in Washington, in Wisconsin. We are bringing together a number of different organizations and coalitions to push for the nuclear weapons ban treaty in the United States, to finally get rid of nuclear weapons. With that, I think that's the thumbnail sketch.
Questions? Thank you, Jeff.
Sure.
I've got a bunch.
Yes.
So, and actually we had Ira at a couple of meetings ago, so.
Yeah, we signed on to co-sponsor his
The Back from the Brink.
Back
Yes.
from the Brink.
Yep.
Which is different.
It is different, yes.
It is different.
It's focused around 5 pieces of legislation in the Senate.
Right.
and it invokes the treaty, the Nuclear Weapons Treaty, but it doesn't directly call for it, and it doesn't necessarily push for the implementation of the treaty in the United States, which is fine. And the 5 things that they are pushing for at the Senate are all good things. We don't want Trump's finger on the button. We don't want a first strike policy. We don't want a hair trigger policy. Those are all good things. But what the nuclear ban campaign does is push for cities and towns, for organizations, for nonprofits, for churches and faith institutions, and for eventually states and the country to identify the economic ties between our society and nuclear weapons manufacturers. And so what we are doing in the campaign, it's a little bit more than just a resolution, basically, that's calling for legislation. But we actually use this report that's put out on an annual basis by a nonprofit in the Netherlands called Don't Bank on the Bomb, which is a report that identifies all of the financial ties between nuclear weapons manufacturers and the rest of society. And so what we're trying to do in the nuclear ban campaign is to identify those ties between, your faith organization or your, municipality or your state, and essentially move towards what we call treaty compliance, which is basically saying, okay, we're not going to have these connections with nuclear weapons manufacturers. If we believe that chemical weapons are bad and biological weapons are bad, well, nuclear weapons are at least just as bad, if not a lot worse, then we should be divesting from these things. And so at the core of the campaign is really a boycott and divestment strategy of when it comes down to it, only really 26 companies that are supporting the production of nuclear weapons.
So that wasn't actually one of my questions, but I'm glad that you elaborated on that. So
Sure.
I wondered, how is your nonprofit status thing?
Yeah.
Do you have an update on that?
It's still pending.
Okay.
Getting 501c3 status. We are a registered, and we have been since September, I think, or October. We are a state nonprofit corporation. We are recognized as a nonprofit at the state level, and we have, a federal EIN and so forth. But the thing that when I took the crash course lesson in executive directorship, you can be a nonprofit but not have 501c3 status, and so that's where we're at. And so we're a nonprofit. We just don't have the 501c3 status.
Because I was curious. I didn't see when I glanced here, but does it say anywhere that if you want to make a donation, write your checks out to?
Yes, the Warren Plout Foundation.
Okay, all right. Just curious about that. And
these are contribution forms in case anybody wants them. But the Warren J. Plout Charitable Trust is basically the 501c3 that is fiscally sponsoring us while we are in process.
Like an umbrella.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're called the fiscal sponsor, and they were the fiscal sponsor for Western Mass Childhood Justice. They are the fiscal sponsor for the Pioneer Valley Worker Center, and so they've got a track record, and it's a good one, and we're really thankful to them for sponsoring us. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And a couple of other, quick things is, and I wanted to ask you about maybe the Poor People's Campaign, because we have had Lindy here from MPP talk about that, and I know aren't you getting involved with?
Yes, I'm actually becoming. I have not yet, and I can't say that we are offering the training yet, but I'm undergoing the process to become a trainer with the Poor People's Campaign. We hosted Kelly Gallagher from the UCC on Martin Luther King Day this past January. She is the coordinator for the state for the UCC on the Poor People's Campaign. We're collaborating with other folks like Arise for Social Justice, who are part of the Poor People's Campaign, and our contribution will be to help train people in civil disobedience.
And there's a kickoff for that in May or something?
I'm not sure when there are events that are going to be happening basically starting from Mother's Day forward. Okay. But the training for people is beginning actually on April 14th.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then one last thing, and I don't know if you think this is a bit off track, that's fine, but I've heard about this new question that they're putting into the census, the 2020 census, and I wondered if you know anyone who's working on that, or if there is any way to keep it out, or it's really going to hurt immigrant communities. It's going to,
I mean, it's really going to hurt Texas, Florida, California, and there's one other country that, a state rather, that has a huge population of undocumented. I think it's New York, actually. It's going to really affect those places because it's anticipated that folks who are undocumented will no longer answer the census, which means that it will de-emphasize the population in those places. It will take away representation, and it will go towards less populated areas, and take away federal funding as well. That's right. And it's actually striking. Sarah Huckabee Sanders actually lied, just straight out lied, and said, "Oh, we've
That's
only had."
New.
Well, she lied about the fact that this question has been on every single census, going back for 50 years except for one. No, that wasn't the case. It actually has not been included in the census for quite some time because it was recognized that. The Constitution isn't concerned about how many people are citizens when you're talking about the census and the population. It's talking about how many people are actually in your state. And so, as I understand it, there really is no way to get around it now. That it's already sort of set. There are states that are filing.
There are a number of lawsuits, including Massachusetts.
Yeah, but because it's basically under the prerogative of the executive branch. There doesn't seem to be a lot of recourse, as I understand it, to getting around it. Yeah.
But theoretically, if these lawsuits made their way to the Supreme Court,
that might not be the best situation, but yeah, right.
Any other questions?
Thanks, John.
Questions, comments?
Yeah.
In regard to the military recruiting young people, I don't think most people are aware of how much effort and how much money they put into it. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Sure. So I don't have the numbers for this year, but as of 4 years ago, the average amount of money that goes to recruiting just one one person for the military is around $50,000. That does not include the salary of the recruiters. It does not include the bonuses or the salary of the person that they're recruiting. It's all of the resources that goes to just yield one recruit. It's basically $50,000 a person, a recruit. And this has really been ratcheted up since 2001, the presence of recruiters in high schools. And that's because of not 9/11, but in fact, No Child Left Behind. And it's really funny because John Olver, one of the first times that I met him, I sat down in his office in Holyoke with him, and I told him that one of the things that we were doing were talking with students that were being solicited to be in the military, and he said, "Well, why are you in high schools? Why do you need to be in high schools to do that?" And I was like, "Well, because since No Child Left Behind, which you voted for, passed, there's a provision that allows." Access for recruiters, and not only just access, but the transfer of information from high schools of personal information of the students to the DoD essentially. And so what we've seen is basically an explosion of recruitment effort in high schools across the country in the form of a presence of recruiters. And I just want to say, we are a pacifist organization, but this isn't a pacifist issue. Because we don't let car salesmen go in and solicit 16-year-olds to take out a loan to buy a car. We don't allow people. We don't allow mortgage companies to go in to say, "Hey, kid, you want to buy a house? Sign your name, and you can take out a mortgage to get a house." But when we're talking about a person, a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid signing away the next 4 to 8 years of their life. There's no problem with it.
What happens to a high school principal who refuses entry?
I think at the time there was a debate about whether parents could sign a release saying they didn't want their child to be subject to this, but they had to actively take that step to
But what
opt
happens
out.
to a principal who just wants?
They will face the threat of being denied federal funds. is the crux of it. And so they will face the threat of losing funding, a significant amount of funding. But the thing to know about this is that there are ways legally that principals can mitigate the access of recruiters to schools. And yes, it is the case that parents and students actually can opt out of having their information sent, but there's a lot of caveats. If they don't do it by the end of September, in the beginning of the school year, it's gone. It's a foregone conclusion. They would have to do it every single year in order for them to not be their information to not be divulged.
Let me stay with the question for a minute.
Yeah.
Is there a systematic way that principals are told the support they will get if they oppose or whatever,
No, I mean, other than us telling them no, but what we do in the report. What we do in the report is actually say to administrators, these are the 10 things that you can do to limit the amount of exposure that your students have to the military.
Because my guess is that most principals, even in Massachusetts, think that they will go to jail.
Nope, that's not the issue. I mean, that might be the case in some circumstances, but what we have found overwhelmingly in the biggest impact of our report, at least what we're hoping, is that schools actually pay attention to these things now, because we have a whole bunch of schools, and we grade all of the schools in the tradition, of we're talking about schools, so we give them grades about how well they limit, how well they protect their students, how much they limit the access of military recruiters to their students. And so the thing that we found overwhelmingly is that most schools don't even track recruiters going into their schools. We have a lot of schools that didn't respond just because they don't even bother to track or figure out where recruiters are going when they get in, they're allowed into the school. And so that's the biggest pushback that we have found in now the third time that we're doing this report, is that schools weren't even tracking this, weren't even bother trying to track this before. And now that they do, there's lots of things that they can do. It's just a matter of getting them to pay attention to this, because of their concerns, letting recruiters in is by and large on the very low end of the scale. And so we're trying to bump up.
The reason I'm asking is
going on.
The reason I'm asking, and then I'll finish with that, is that at the college level, about 10 years ago, I did refuse some recruiters once. Well, more than once, for a year. And in fact, nothing happened. They went off and bothered somebody else.
Was this a private school or a public
school?
Oh, wow.
In Connecticut.
Yeah. To be honest, unless every school started to do this, I suspect that if a principal actually said no, you're not allowed in the school, it probably for the first few schools that happened, the recruiters probably would not bother. But they don't even. But our point is that you don't even have to do that. There are ways that you can legally, feasibly, just put up just put up the smallest of barriers to recruiters, like telling them that they have to request when they're going to come, or that they have to check in with the guidance counselor, that they have to be overseen by a staff member. All of these different things, like their material has to be reviewed. Like this is the other thing, is that I have personally talked to students. And other people, who have graduated and just are looking for a job, who are told by recruiters, tell me the top 3 places in the world you want to go. Now, I can't guarantee you're going to be sent to your number 1, but we probably can arrange for number 2 or number 3. And I mean, these are kids. They don't necessarily know any better. And so it's really basic things that can prevent or at least greatly mitigate the exposure that kids have to recruiters.
So
one other thing, I was a member of Vets for Peace, and I do sort of like counter-recruiting. They go in and say, this is the real story.
Yep.
And I know it happens, doesn't happen a lot, but there are ex-vets that do that.
And there are vets that I know of who are not pacifists, who when I come across somebody who's interested in joining the military, I say, okay, just call this person and ask, because just the fantasy that military recruiters present to students is so unrealistic and crazy that all it takes is like 5 minutes on the phone with an actual vet to you can be in favor of having a standing military and so on and so forth. But I remember I had lunch a few years ago with a woman from Iraq. She was working for the United Nations, but she was from Iraq, and she wanted to know what I did. And I told her about all the list of things that I did. And she said, "Wait a second, you're in high school." And she says, "Why do you talk to high school students?" I said, "Well, it's that military recruiters go to them." And I can't forget the aghast look that she had. She's like, "You solicit children to go into the military?" And then she said, Even Saddam would not, bring children into the military. In Iraq, under Saddam, you had to be out of school and not have gone into college, not have gone into, the civil service, or not having gone, and then you can be conscripted, but not a 16, 17, 18-year-old. And I was like, oh man, like this woman who was, comparing like Saddam Hussein's conscription policy to United States military recruitment policy, and it's like, we're not looking very good. Like that's the craziness of what we're dealing with here.
So if they were doing better tracking, then it would perhaps give schools the opportunity, if they had more control or could schedule it, give the opportunity for vets and this type of, hearing the other side of the story to, perhaps, well, if the military recruiters come in, we're also going to have, is that happening?
The school, in the report, what we show is that the schools that actually bother to track when military recruiters come in, they actually are able to respond to our public records requests. The more attention they pay to how much recruiters come into their schools and so forth, the better they are at limiting the number of visits that they get. Because recruiters will go to a school that doesn't care, they'll go every few days, and they do go to schools if a school doesn't particularly pay attention to how often they come and go. The schools that do have recruiters come less often, and they're usually better about honoring students' opt-out requests.
Are they targeting specific schools based on socioeconomic levels?
Yes, but what we have found is, everybody presumes that, well, Holyoke High School, they've got they probably are recruiting up a storm. In fact, no. They had sort of abandoned Holyoke, not completely abandoned, they still visit, but because you need to have a high school degree, and in Holyoke High School, the conditions are so crappy that students, there's like a 50% graduation rate. So they look for a place in which there's going to be a high graduation rate, but the kids are not likely or can't afford to go to college afterwards, which is why Smith Vocational High School is the #1 place for recruiters and recruits year after year. They have twice as many recruits into the military every year than any other school in the Pioneer Valley. It's because the students there are almost guaranteed to graduate, and most of them come from working class families and they can't necessarily afford to pay for college on their own.
They also have some technical skill.
Sure.
At the end of their high school education.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much, Jeff.
Sure.
Get on the mailing list.
Yes.
Let's stay in touch. Yeah.